Well, thank you. Good morning. Like Pastor Chad said, my name's Jordan. My wife Jessica and I have been attending and members here at Lifegate for about a year and a half now. We love this church, so we're glad you're here this morning. And we're going to be wrapping up our series that we've been in for the last 4 weeks called You Asked For It. Real quick, by a show of hands, how many of you have made it to at least 2 of these weeks in this series? All right. How many of you made it to all 4? All right. You guys beat first service, so pat yourself on the back. Good job. Well, we're gonna be concluding the series, like I said, and like Pastor Chad mentioned, talking about the topic of anxiety. And I think that's important to talk about because as good as life can be, it's not without its challenges, right? And it kind of reminds me of a story of when I was younger. I was probably 11 or 12 years old. I grew up in South Florida, and that was a time where kids still played outside. Right? We didn't do video games. We got in the dirt. If you're under 18 in here, outside is out of a house. There's no air conditioning. There's the sun, a ball of fire, and you drank from a hose, right? And somehow we're all alive. But we spent most of our time outside, and a lot of what we did was, we had a canal and a lake behind our house. You don't realize how good you have it when you're young. We just would fish every day, and then if we weren't fishing, either me and my friends, we'd be fishing, or we'd be, shooting our pellet guns, right? And so this one day, we were out back, and we had our BB guns, right? And so often it would start with us shooting random targets. We would make different targets or out of cardboard, and we'd do that for a while, but that would always get boring, right? And so when that got boring, we would turn our attention to the local duck population. Okay, listen, I told this story once in Southern California. I know Burleson can handle this, okay? All right. We turned our attention to now also, if you're concerned, just know these ducks, they have really strong feathers, okay? And so this one time, we're in the backyard and we're shooting our pellet guns, and I dare my friend Sam. Sam was my buddy that whenever there's a story about Sam and I, we were usually up to no good, like the good kind of no good, right? And we all have a friend like that where your stories, you're like that person and me, we did some fun things, right? Sam was my guy. And I was hanging with Sam, and I dare him, hey, I bet you can't hit that duck. It was like 3 houses down on the other side of the canal. So if you don't know, that's almost an impossible shot with a BB gun. Well, before I could even get the dare out of my mouth, Sam's pumping the gun, right? You're supposed to do it 10 times. He pumps it 12. Okay, you just got to make sure he's getting the distance right. And he lets the shot fire. And, the planets must have aligned just right. Because this day, that impossible shot Sam takes, it hits the duck in the neck, right? And those tough feathers I told you about, they really protect the torso. The neck is a rather exposed part of the duck, okay? So in this moment, the duck begins to panic, and it starts squawking, right? Its wings are going all over the place. It makes its way onto the land, and it's got like 5 friends. So all the ducks that are with him begin to do the same thing he's doing. They're making all this noise, going crazy. And to make matters worse, this all was unfolding in the backyard of a house that was throwing a pool party for their kid. Yeah. And so it's like the music stops at the party. Everybody's watching because these ducks are losing it. They're going crazy. And then across the canal, a few houses down, are 2 little kids with pellet guns. And I want you to know I did what was right in that moment. I did what all of us would have done. I ran inside, right? Left Sam alone out there. He shot him. I didn't. And now I'm an adult, right? And Sam and I are still really good friends. We talk about that sometimes. We obviously know that wasn't our brightest moment, right? It was not necessarily our finest hour. We think about it, and it's like, man, we were kind of little jerks, right? Like, that duck didn't deserve that. He's minding his own little duck life, waddling around, and then out of nowhere, right? But the more I think about it, and especially with today's topic, it's a little bit kind of like a snapshot of life. Right? Have you ever felt that way? Like maybe you were minding your own business, and then out of nowhere, 2 delinquents snipe you with a BB. And maybe for you, it wasn't a BB. For you, maybe a loved one received a bad diagnosis. Or maybe your marriage fell apart. Maybe you received a demotion or were laid off. Maybe you're simply a Cowboys fan, right? Yeah. I'm a Dolphins fan. I know your pain, okay? But seriously, right, these moments in life, they can kind of happen out of the blue, and if we're honest, they can be overwhelming. And if we're really honest this morning, we'd admit that sometimes we're even afraid. If you follow Jesus, right, then these seasons in life bring about a whole new group of questions. Questions like, where are you, God? God, do you even care? God, why don't you do something about that? And it's the reality of suffering in this world that leaves the door open for anxiety to take control of our minds and ultimately our lives. When my wife we have two boys, when my wife was pregnant with our second son, we had gone to the doctor for a routine ultrasound, and for all we knew, everything was great. And we leave the doctor's appointment, and we got a call saying that we needed to come back in for a follow-up ultrasound immediately. And they didn't really give us any details, so we went back in, and they sent us to a different place. They had a different technician look, and we were there a lot longer than normal. And in that appointment, they let us know that they had discovered a blockage in our son's urinary tract, and that they were worried for his bladder, but really worried for his kidneys. And they weren't sure about the damage and the extent of the damage done to his kidneys, so they needed to perform an emergency C-section to get him out and be able to perform some tests. So they scheduled this C-section, and a couple days later, our son Colin was born. And we are instantly ushered into the NICU, and I'm with him, and we're going through, and they start running all these tests on Colin to make sure he was okay. And obviously it was scary and intense. We were there for 5 days, and they performed a surgery at Rady's Children's Hospital to remove the blockage and make sure he was okay. We had to stay for several other weeks in the NICU for them to monitor him and monitor his kidneys, make sure they were working and functioning correctly. So we were there for several weeks, and on our last day, before they released us, the urologist told my wife and I that this was going to be a day-by-day thing. That for the majority of Colin's life, he'd have to be monitored throughout childhood and adolescence, because they still weren't certain how things were going to play out down the road. And I remember I left feeling like, what? You mean he's not all better? God, are you listening? For the first 2 years of his life, we spent multiple days each week with his team of doctors. And they were preparing for a pretty intense surgery. They let us know that when he was 2 years old, we'd have to have this really invasive surgery to try to fix the situation with his kidneys. And they let us know that we had to wait till he was 2 years old because it was so intense. But it was really kind of a last resort type of option. And if that wasn't scary enough, they let us know that the success rate for this surgery is only 5%. When I say I was dreading that day, man, I mean, every day for like 2 years, I was living with this pit in my stomach, counting down the days. It's almost like I felt like I could get sick at any moment. The stress and anxiety from that situation, along with the normal stresses of life. I was a young husband. We were pretty much newlyweds. We had a 1-year-old son, so we were new parents. We were pastoring at a mega church in San Diego. Paying your bills in Southern California is stressful. I was at the end of my rope, just trying to hold it all together. So I did what any good Southern California does to relax. I went to the beach. I love to surf, so I was going to go out and surf just to kind of reduce some of the stress and get in the wet water, which usually helped. And I got out there, and it was a bigger wave day than normal, which got me excited. And I'm sitting out there, and instead of being able to function and surf like usual, I began to feel this tightness in my chest. Things began to feel like they were spinning, and I experienced my very first panic attack. And let me tell you, if you're going to have a panic attack, especially your first one, you don't want to do it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean during a large swell with offshore winds, okay? Choose to be on dry ground. After, nearly drowning, and as if that wasn't enough, drowning, panic became a way of life. I completely changed. The fun pastor of a mega church, leading hundreds of students to Christ through weekly dodgeball and messages. The speaker and pastor who loved to routinely speak for the adult of thousands of people became afraid of large crowds. More importantly, the husband who showed up for his wife when she needed him, and the dad who always had time for wrestling with his boys, became a distant shell of himself and spent too many of his nights hiding in the garage because he didn't want his family to see him have another meltdown. At that point, I believed my anxiety would pass quickly, and so I felt like if I could just avoid my family and avoid my close friends, that maybe if I did that long enough, the old me would return and they would even know that I was struggling. And when that didn't happen, I had to take a step back from ministry. I started taking medication, and when that didn't work, I started other medications. Few people understand how hard it is to go from meds to meds and maintain hope that the next one might work. I started therapy. Actually, I went to lots of therapies. For a solid year of my life, I would go spend 2 days a week and talk to a horse. And believe it or not, that was actually more helpful than some of the medication. And just to put you all at ease, no, the horse never talked back. We moved to Denver for a few years just to kind of get to a new fun city. We thought, hey, a new place might get us, distracted from the chaos in our home and be there long enough for the anxiety to pass. And when that didn't happen, ultimately, we made the decision to be back in Texas surrounded by family. And I say all that because I want you to know if you're here today and your daily battle is to get out of bed and not let the panic control your day, me too. And I know for some of you in here, that disqualifies me from teaching on this topic because I haven't conquered the beast. But for others of you, it's the very credentials needed because you want to hear from someone who can relate. Regardless, my prayer is that all of us in here will be encouraged today. Now, while I'm up here and being the one talking about my struggles with the stresses of life and anxiety, I know that I'm not the only one in here today who's struggling in this way. Honestly, with the track record of the last few years, I would be shocked if all of us in here at some point didn't have to breathe into a bag or two. But I don't have to assume, right? The stats support my claim. Current numbers indicate that roughly 50% of Americans experience a mental health crisis such as anxiety or depression in their lifetime. And most often when you experience one, you also experience the other. So if numbers isn't your thing, let me help you understand. 50%, that's half of us in this room. And the other half, you might not be experiencing it, but you probably know somebody, or perhaps you're even shouldering the burden of someone you love who's experiencing something like this. And that can also be a difficult, often thankless job with its own trauma as you watch somebody you love suffer. My wife could talk to you for days. And it's significant to understand that so many of us, 50% of us, have experienced this because so many of us often suffer in silence, especially in the church. Right? We begin to believe the lies that we're all alone or that nobody would understand. The facts are that half of us in this room understand that battle all too well. My wife and I love LifeGate because this is a church where you don't have to pretend to be perfect in order to belong. In fact, last year when we started attending regularly, Pastor Chad and Pastor Amber, knowing all that my wife and I had been through with my depression and anxiety, they took us under their wing and told us that they wanted to be a part of the healing process. Right? They saw through my hurt and gave me a place to rehab my leadership and public speaking gift by getting to volunteer and teach with the student ministry. So when I say this is a safe place, it's because I've experienced it here. And it's because of Pastor Chad and Amber's leadership and their authenticity that us as a church, we would feel safe enough to say we want to talk about this topic, that we would choose this as one of our topics for this series. So why talk about this at church? Well, one, again, because you asked for it, but also because I believe there's a real enemy who wants us to not talk about this. He would rather you not get help. He wants the church to avoid topics like this. He doesn't want you to be encouraged. Instead, he wants you to assume that things could never improve for you in this area of your life. And while managing my anxiety is still a daily battle, the person I am today is far better than who I was at my lowest. In fact, me being up here on a stage is proof that we don't have to get stuck living in the paralyzing grip of fear. There was a point where I swore I would never do this again. I don't have all the answers. I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'll leave the smart stuff to them. Today, I want to focus on just a few key thoughts, right, that I have learned that help me experience some real freedom and peace in this area of my life. So as I jump into these thoughts, I kind of want to start with the big idea for today. And if you're taking notes, you can kind of write this big idea down on those lines at the bottom of your sheet there. And the big idea is simply this: when life feels out of control, God is still in control. You know, anxiety flourishes in the unknowns and the what-ifs. So today, if nothing else, I want us all to walk out of here knowing that God is in control and he has a plan. And this is really what the Apostle Paul was driving at in 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 9. He sets up this idea that God has a plan and he's had one from the beginning. Listen to this. This is what Paul says. He says, "For God saved us and called us to live a holy life. He did this not because we deserved it, but because that was his plan from before the beginning of time, to show us his grace through Christ Jesus." You know, Paul lets us know that God has a purpose and a plan, that God's working things out the way he knows best. Basically, what he's saying is God is in control. Right? And the Bible word for God being in control is this big word, it's sovereign. It says that God is sovereign. Right? The definition of sovereignty is simply this: God, as the ruler of the universe, is in complete control over everything that happens. Psalm 135, verse 6 supports that. It says, "The Lord does whatever pleases him in the heavens and on the earth, in the seas and all their depths." Again, basically, God is in control. Now, God is in control. It sounds nice, and it makes an excellent bumper sticker, but do we really believe this? I mean, how can God, in all of his infinite power, love, and grace, be in control of a world that experiences things like cancer, human trafficking, genocide, and the Kardashians? I almost pulled that joke. I'm glad I didn't. How can God possibly be in control when life often feels very much the opposite? When life hurts, it's in these moments we all often ask God, why don't you do something about that? Over the years, my anxiety seems to strike the hardest when I couldn't see how things were going to work out. Right? When the unknowns in life seemed far greater than my faith. And when you're going through these types of seasons, you know, something challenging, and you hear God is in control, it doesn't always make everything feel better. In fact, when you go through those times, you know, and you understand that God's in control, it can honestly make you feel things that are very different than comfort. Right? If we're honest, we'd say sometimes we experience these moments, and what we feel is frustration. Right? This is a natural response to God being in control when everything, including our emotions, feel out of control. Because, you know, we say things like, if you're in control, why is this thing happening? More specifically, what we say is, God, why are you letting this happen? Maybe you experience fear. You know, we can become afraid of the outcome. Really, the fear stems from this question: what if God doesn't handle the situation the way I want him to? If God's in control, that means that I'm not, and giving up control can be very difficult. Or maybe what you experience is confusion. God, I thought you were looking out for me and my happiness. As a student pastor and a young adult pastor, I heard this all the time: how can God be good and allow bad things to happen to good people? Or they'd say, I believe God exists, but is he paying attention to what's happening to me? And I want you to know that these are very valid responses, right? And God's not angry with us when we experience these emotions and we bring our doubts and concerns to him. He's big enough and strong enough to handle the truth about the way our circumstances make us feel. But I also believe that in the midst of these moments, God's word provides a roadmap for processing through our fears, right? That we don't have to get stuck living in the fear of the unknowns. And an accurate understanding of what God's word teaches in regards to God being in control, even in the midst of life's storms, can help us move forward in faith rather than fear. And so if that's the goal, to move forward in faith rather than fear, it starts with understanding this first thought. God can be in control, and life can be hard at the same time. The truth is, God never promises that following him will lead to a pain-free existence. The problem is that's kind of what we all want, right? None of us woke up this morning hoping that the pastor was going to talk about how we have to struggle. Right? We want life to be struggle-free, and technology has only made this even more true. I find it funny when I see people complain. Maybe they had a delay at the airport, or maybe their plane was delayed by 30 minutes, and so they're all frustrated because their connecting flight, they didn't get a chance to get a Cinnabon in between flights, and their life is ruined somehow. And sometimes I just want to let them know, like, hey, 100 years ago, the trip you just took would have taken you 3 weeks. And you would have been traveling via wagon, right? That those of you who started the journey, you wouldn't necessarily end the journey. You'd start as children, you arrive as adults. And we get frustrated when our plane is 30 minutes late, and we post, selfies with the hashtag unbelievable. Hashtag so tired. Worst day ever. We're about easy. We want Google Maps to give us 3 options. And we'll pick the easiest route and avoid all the tolls. So naturally, we begin to expect this from God. God, you're in control. You're sovereign. Give me 3 options and I'll pick my favorite. And sometimes he does. But sometimes he doesn't. Listen to what Jesus tells his followers about what they can expect along the journey of their lives. You may have heard this before, but if not, John 16:33, he says, "Here on earth you'll have many trials and sorrows, but take heart because I've overcome the world." And you see, even though Jesus tells us this, my anxiety in the midst of what my wife and I went through with our second son stemmed from overlooking this fact. It's almost like I half expected life to be perfect because I was a believer, and when it wasn't, my anxiety spiked. And I'm sure that's many of us in here when we face these trials that Jesus warned us about. It's almost like we say, well, I know he said it, but I didn't know he actually meant it. And it's not just you and I that feel stress and anxiety and depression. Many of the heroes in the Bible did as well. Apostle Paul, the one who told Timothy, hey, God has a plan from the beginning, wrestled with deep despair and feeling of overwhelm and pressure. Listen what he says in 2 Corinthians 1:8. He says, "We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself." Sometimes people tell me, the Bible, no, I have a hard time reading it. It doesn't really relate with today. It's like, I relate with that. I think most of us have moments of our life where we can say, man, I relate with that. Paul used some strong words. He didn't even know if he would be able to make it. And it wasn't just Paul, it was King David, right? If you don't know who David is, he's the one who beat Goliath. He's really good with a sling, and he became king, a hero, right, in the Bible. Listen to how he described how he was feeling in Psalm 42. He says, "Why, my soul, are you downcast?" He was depressed. "Why so disturbed within me?" He was also anxious. I can relate with that. And it wasn't a mild case either. If you read the rest of Psalm 42, you'd realize David didn't think he was going to get through it. And these are 2 of the greatest leaders in all of the Bible, and yet they experienced real hardship. They went through times where they were mentally exhausted and anxious, but we still read about them today because God is sovereign and in control. And since we have the benefit of reading the rest of their story, it's finished, you and I can all agree confidently that God had a plan for them. But with our lives, the stories aren't finished. We don't have that vantage point. So when we experience something tough, our anxiety tries to lie to us and tell us God's no longer in control. Everything's grim. There's no hope. But the truth is that just like God was with Paul and David and had a plan for them, he's with us even when things seem uncertain. Now, does understanding that we're not alone in our struggles make all the circumstances in our lives instantly better? No. But at least as we go through these challenges, we can trust that it hasn't caught God off guard. He wasn't sleeping on the job, but rather he's aware of what we're experiencing and he cares. God's in control even when life seems out of control. He has a plan, which brings us to thought number 2. Trusting God's plan means surrendering mine. Right? When life flips upside down, we often feel as if we know what needs to be done in order to fix the problems. Right? We develop our perfect solutions, and then we sit back and wait for God to work things out the way we decided they should be. This is really the reason behind the natural response of fear when you find out that God's in control and things are hard. Because we realize if God's in control, that means I'm not. And what if God doesn't fix it the way I want him to? It's kind of like when my wife drives. Now, I'm going to be careful here. When my wife drives, I sit in the passenger seat and I white-knuckle the handle. They put it there for us, right? Like it's there for a reason. I use it, okay? I white-knuckle that handle. And it's not because, I want to be clear, it's not because she's a bad driver. She just drives differently. Her driving only bothers me because it's not me, right? We all think we do it better. It's gotten so bad where she no longer even wants to drive. She's tired of my 2 cents of how she didn't stop properly at that stop sign. But they're there for a reason. She gets tired of me being a backseat driver. And we do this to God. Because many of us don't want God to be in control. We just want him to take control when things get tough. If we're honest, we would all admit that we're control freaks. We only want Jesus to take the wheel when we're about to crash. But as soon as he gets us around the debris in the road, we change the song and sing, Jesus, give me back the wheel. But don't go too far. I might need you again. And if so, you can take control for a second. What we really say is, God, you're the fixer of my problems, not the driver of my car. R.C. Sproul, I love the way he says it. He says, most Christians salute the sovereignty of God, but believe in the sovereignty of man. But the right response to God being in control in the midst of life's chaos is not to insist on God fixing things my way, but rather to come to a place where I can trust him regardless if he does it the way I want or not. And we get a perfect picture of this when we look at Jesus. In the garden, if you don't know, right before Jesus went to the cross to die, he was experiencing some anxiety. And he took a group of his closest friends to a garden to pray, to process through what he was feeling. And in that moment, he's experiencing this anxiety, and he brings his anxiety to the Lord. And listen to his prayer. It's a prayer that I'm sure many of us have prayed, but I think he shows us how we can process our own anxiety with how he ends his prayer. The first half, I've definitely prayed this, and I'm sure you have as well. Listen, he says, Father, if you're willing, please take this cup of suffering away from me. Now, I've made that prayer. But what Jesus shows us here in the second half is a little bit different. He says, yeah, I want your will to be done, not mine. The way he ends it is a surrendering of his plans, and trusts God's plans. He demonstrates in the garden that night that we have to hold our plans with open hands, that we can pray and ask God to do things a certain way, but what we must understand is that he's ultimately calling the shots. And we hold our desires with open hands and say, God, here's my plan. Do with it what you want because you're in control. You're sovereign. And surrendering control in the midst of your pain can be very scary, right? It can often feel like stepping off a cliff with a rope swing. It's one thing to say you trust the rope can hold you while you're standing on the ledge. It's a whole other level of trust to step off, right? It says, I'm no longer in control of the outcome, but I'm trusting that you'll carry me. It's a deeper level of faith. And if you're like me, I want to make this clear. If you're like me and your battle has been with your own mind, and fear and anxiety have been holding you back from moving forward and trusting God with your life, I want you to know that you can hold on to Jesus and trust him. He's strong enough to carry you. And he has good plans for you. Romans 8:28 says this, "We know that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God and are called according to his purpose for them." Now, this doesn't mean it will always all work out. Sometimes it means that it doesn't. But what it does promise is that even if we can't see the purpose, God has a purpose and it's good, and so is he. You know, before I knew Christ, and I was about 20 years old, I was walking through a real deep depression. And mental health has been a part of my journey for the better part of my life. And I actually had an in-person stay in an inpatient hospital for about 6 months because I wanted to take my life. And while I was there, I was actually in the Marine Corps at the time. So I was staying in San Diego at Balboa Hospital. I was there for 6 months. And, you know, years went by. I got out of the Marine Corps and ended up getting called into ministry, went to Southwestern Assemblies of God University, met my beautiful wife. Like, God did some incredible things, called us into ministry. We went to San Diego to work at a church. So 10 years go by, and I'm back in San Diego, and life was different. God had done some cool things. And our first son was born. And he was a week old, so we decided we're going to take him to the San Diego Zoo, which is incredible. And if you know anything about the San Diego Zoo, it literally shares the same parking lot as Balboa Hospital. So in order to get there, we got to drive by where I stayed for those 6 months. And I remember I'm driving, and in that moment, as we go past the hospital, I looked up in my rear view and I saw my newborn son in the car seat. I saw my wife next to me, and I became emotional. Surprise, surprise. And the reason why is because in that moment I felt like God told me, "Jordan, years ago when you were in that hospital, I knew this day was coming." And it was his way of saying, I had a plan. When you couldn't see it, I saw it. And so that was my first son. And our second son, our kids are 12 months apart. So 12 months go by. And now my second son's born, and he's having these complications. So we're back in a hospital. I'm in the NICU a year after the San Diego Zoo. And I'm sitting in the NICU holding my son Colin. And I'm crying, and I'm angry, and I'm scared. And in that moment, I felt like God said, "Jordan, last year when you were going to the zoo, I knew this day was coming." And at first I was frustrated, but I knew it was his way of saying, I'm the same God today that was with you back in the Marine Corps that had a plan that you couldn't see. And I'm the same God today that in the midst of it right now that you don't understand the purpose, I still have one, and it's good. Do you trust me? And it still feels like stepping off a cliff, holding on to nothing but the hope that God is good and he's in control. And even if it doesn't go the way I want it to go, I have no other hope but to trust him and his plan. And I can do this even when the outcome is unclear, because although I may not know the purpose, I know him and he's good. So I'm learning, and I've been learning, to respond like point number 3. When I want to worry, I remember to pray. Matthew 5:4 says, "God blesses those who mourn, for they'll be comforted." The Greek word there that they use for comforted can literally be translated in English to he's drawn near to your side. He'll draw near to your side. When we worry, we spend time focused on the what ifs that we can't control. When we pray, we spend time with the one who is in control of everything. When I worry, I magnify the fear. When I pray, I connect with the one whose perfect love casts out fear. When we're in a place of desperation and heartache, Jesus says, you don't have to go through it alone. I'm going to draw near to you in those times. To keep my anxiety at bay, I've developed many new behaviors. Morning ice baths. I work out daily. I eat right. I watch my caffeine intake, right? I get enough sunlight in the morning and throughout my day. I have a bedtime. But if I'm not careful, I can begin to believe that my anxiety is only physical and emotional and forget that it's also spiritual. And so the thing I want you to know is that the most important behavior that I've found when dealing with my anxiety is prayer. Because it's an opportunity for me to trust God and say, God, this thing that I wanted to worry about, instead I'm going to choose to pray about. And I'm going to trust that you're in control. And it's not all on me to make it work. And I can get that deep breath that I'm looking for. I've heard people in the past say things like faith or church is a crutch. And I used to be offended by that. I take it pretty negatively. Until I felt broken. Because when you're broken, a crutch sounds awesome. So now when I hear people say faith is a crutch, I simply agree with them and say, more than you know. That's why the Apostle Paul encourages us to pray instead of worry. Philippians 4:6-7, he says, never worry about anything. But in every situation, let God know what you need in prayers and requests while giving thanks. Then God's peace, which goes beyond anything we can imagine, will guard your thoughts and emotions through Christ Jesus. I love this because Paul's reminder is you should pray. Don't worry, pray. Don't be anxious, pray. But Paul also understands the difference between God's ability and God's sovereignty. He knows God can do anything. But he also lets you know God's in control, which he's sovereign, so it gives him the right to call the shots. So he doesn't promise an answered prayer, he promises peace. And in the 1800s, there was a guy by the name of Horatio Spafford. And he was a real estate kind of mogul, right? Had a huge real estate business. And about the mid-1800s, during the Chicago fire, half of his real estate properties burnt up. Financial chaos. At the same time, more tragically, his 4-year-old son, around that time, died of scarlet fever. And with all the loss and with all the pain and heartache, his decision was that his family needed to get away and have a vacation. So he sent his 4 daughters and his wife on a ship to England for a vacation. He had to finish some business. He was going to hop on another ship and meet them in England. However, on their way to England, the ship with his daughters and wife was involved in a collision. And all 4 of his daughters died. His wife was the only survivor. She made it to England and sent him a telegram saying, I'm alive, but I'm alone. He instantly hops on a ship to meet his wife in England so they could grieve together. And on his way, on the journey to England, the captain of the ship that he was on let him know when they were over the part of the waters where his daughter's ship went down. And it was at that spot, in that very moment, where Horatio wrote the song that many of us know, It Is Well With My Soul. And I remember when I first heard that story, I remember thinking, how could it be well with his soul? Nothing had changed. He hadn't even had a chance to grieve with his wife. The only thing I can assume is that Horatio understood that God was in control. And that even though he couldn't understand that in that moment, that God had a purpose and a plan. And so while the circumstances hadn't changed, he had found it to be well with his soul. I don't know what you're facing today. But my prayer is that you can leave here today able to say, God, I trust you. I trust that you're in control. I trust that you have a plan. And ultimately, regardless of my circumstances that I face when I leave these doors, I'm trusting that you're good and it's well with my soul.
Thank you for joining us online today. Make sure and hit subscribe to this channel and hit the bell for more notifications. We can't wait to engage with you this week.